Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry is a sweeping prose epic that takes us to the waning days of the Old West on an unforgettable journey across the canvas that is the United States, with characters who become our dear friends. And this novel offers us one of the most sublime, extended meditations on the human condition that can be found anywhere in 20th century literature. For many, this profoundly crafted saga and this Pulitzer Prize winning masterwork is one of the candidates for the great American novel. Lonesome Dove is frequently talked about in the same breath as Moby Dick and East of Eden. America's national epic is the Western, and Lonesome Dove is the Western that redefined and reinvented the entire genre, simultaneously demythologizing the West and also inspiring an entire generation of readers and writers, and readers from all over the entire world have fallen deeply in love with Lonesome Dove because McMurtry has hit upon something powerfully universal in this story. This is a book that teaches us how to live. It's a book that explores our common mortality and helps us to get to grips with it. And we see over the course of this story that learning to live essentially means learning how to die. This is a book that says memento mori, therefore carpe diem. Lonesome Dove is all about where we can find meaning in life, how to find meaning in hardship. It's a book about love and friendship in all its many manifestations. And ultimately, this is a book that reminds us that we are never too old to heal the rift within ourselves, and we are never too old to embark on a new journey. And the adventure at the heart of this story, I believe, is ultimately everyone's adventure. Lonesome Dove is so special to me and holds a lot of personal meaning. So I have a long-term reading ritual in which I return to the book every few years, and it's given me an incredible amount of joy to hear from endless readers for whom Lonesome Dove is an intensely special book too. Lonesome Dove has such a special place in my heart, and it's one of those books that really proves the idea that one measure of a literary work's worth is in its rereadability, because you can reread this one endlessly and you're always going to get something new out of it. You are always going to find fresh insights because this book keeps us company as we change across the course of our lives. And everyone that I know who has read Lonesome Dove once has either gone on to reread it again or plans to very soon. Similar to War and Peace and Middlemarch and Bleak House, we read this 800 plus page behemoth because it offers us an incredibly immersive experience. It perfectly captures a time and a place so vividly that you feel as though you are living there. It feels as though we've stumbled into a time machine and been transported back a century and a half. But we read primarily to spend time in the company of characters who are so compelling, who are so relatable, psychologically complex, beautiful, and realistically crafted that they actually cease to be protagonists and become instead old friends. Friends who will make you laugh, who will make you cry, and who will ultimately remind you of why, despite the harshness of the world, why life is worth living. And it's worth living as fully as possible. And I'm so intensely excited that Lonesome Dove is the first book of the year and the big read that will be kicking off our reading programme for 2026 at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We are starting the year off strong with a deep read through and a lecture series of this masterpiece at patreon.com/hardcore literature. And so today, in this spoiler-free discussion, I would love to give you some tips for how to best break into it and appreciate it and get the most out of your reading experience. We're going to be talking about the historical context of the Old West, and that means rangers and bandits and Comanches. We're going to talk about the development of the Western genre, from pulp novels and cinema through to literary masterpieces like this. We'll talk about Larry McMurtry's aims with the novel, and I'm going to give you some mindsets to bear in mind that will help you break into not only this work, but any long, great work of literature. But let's start things off today by setting the scene, talking about the premise of the story and meeting the central characters. And McMurtry really does show us that character is story. That's how compelling his protagonists are. Again, I'm going to be staying away from plot spoilers and details for what happens in the story. So if you're a first-time reader, you're in safe hands today. And if you're a rereader, following our lecture series at the book club, I'd ask you to preserve the surprises of the story as we ride on through together, and that way you'll be able to enjoy seeing first-time readers have that beautiful experience of falling in love with Lonesome Dove. So let's talk about the story. McMurtry takes us back to the 1870s and, as I said, the waning days of the Old West, to a poky little border town called, as you might already have guessed from the title, Lonesome Dove. And this border town is out in the hotter than hell desert heat of South Texas, and McMurtry immediately sets to work inaugurating us into the company we're going to keep. He makes us one of the Hat Creek Cattle Company, which is run by two retired Texas Rangers and lifelong friends who are polar opposites of one another. Polar opposites in their life philosophy, how they approach the world and the people around them. We're talking about Captain Woodrow F. Call and Captain Augustus, or Gus, McCrae. I absolutely adore these characters, and I contend that it won't take you very long before you fall in love with them too. And the central premise, the backbone of the novel, comes in the form of a grand cattle drive. One last great adventure for these two old-timers from Texas all the way up to Montana, from the south of the country to the north. We're talking about a journey with 2,000 cows that will take the better part of half a year across thousands of miles of harsh, brutal, life-threatening terrain where everything is against you. Threats from Mother Nature in the form of tempestuous storms and wild animals. Threats from one's fellow man in the form of vengeful Native American tribes. And of course, most fatally of all, threats from oneself, because this is a journey that really reveals who a person is. The harshness of this journey reveals one's character. It will show these characters exactly what they're made of and also tell them what their lives have been all about. Now, the very first obstacle when you pick up Lonesome Dove for the first time comes in the fact that it takes a really long time before we even get on that cattle drive. You read the blurb, you see it's about a big adventure across the country, and you wonder, when is that going to happen? Because the pages go by, and you start to think, hey, nothing much is really happening. This novel offers us a really slow build, which I absolutely adore. I love stories that take their time. I love writers that really take their time to craft the world and to get us settling into it. It feels as though we have been living in Lonesome Dove, this border town, for a very long time by the time we finally get on that cattle drive, and we feel as though we know the characters very, very well. McMurtry puts so much care and attention into really crafting the world. But time and again, I've seen readers and lovers of Lonesome Dove discover and also offer the advice that something rather magical happens roughly around the 100-page mark. Maybe a bit before for some readers, maybe a bit after, but about 100 pages or so, and I've actually marked the exact moment in my personal copy that is the inflection point when we realise that we've been pulled right into the story, and we're going to be talking about this in our next lecture at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. It takes a bit of time before you suddenly discover, hey, I love these characters, I care about them, I care about what happens to them. You spend that first whack of the novel wondering when the story's going to get started, and then you realise, hey, a lot has actually been happening. It's all interior, it's all internal. Some of the greatest books of all time show us that the drama is always inward, and external journeys are ostensibly about one thing, but they are valuable insofar as they give rise to the internal journey that we are going through. And over the course of this year, we're going to read some incredible sagas together that show us how much of life really is internal, how much drama is internal. We're going to see that with Dostoevsky, we're going to see that with Proust, we're going to see that with Elena Ferrante. We're reading all of those together over the course of 2026. It's going to be an incredible year. If you haven't seen the schedule video outlining the programme for the year, then you can see that at patreon.com/hardcore literature. So give it 100 pages or so and you'll find that you suddenly can't put the book down. And what's really wonderful is if the slow start proves to be an obstacle for first-time readers, that is actually one of the things that rereaders love the most. I love that beginning. I love living through it again whenever I come back to Lonesome Dove. I love just kicking back with our old friends, sipping some whiskey on the porch, watching the sunset and chewing the fat with this incredible cast of characters. So that's my advice first and foremost. Commit yourself going in to at least 100 pages and the rest of the novel should fall into place for you, and many find that they actually end up wanting to inhale it. They can't put it down. You need to really consciously take the concerns of the characters on as though they were your own. This is one of the many blessings of great literature, is the fact that we can defer our problems for a moment whilst we're living in the world and take the concerns of others on. And what's really impressive is McMurtry continues to weave new characters in and out of the fabric of this story, right through to the very end of this vast multi-cast narrative. But the first 100 pages should give you a good acquaintance with the main players. In addition to our two ex-Ranger buddies, Cool and McCrae, you've also got the new up-and-coming generation in the form of characters like Newt. You've got the young cowboys who the older generation must teach and then pass the torch to. You've got wanted men, criminals, outlaws on the run, like Jake Spoon, a man whose poor decisions are starting to catch up with him. You've got Mexican bandits, like the camp cook, Bolivar or Bol. You've got former slaves, now freed men, like the character Dietz, one of my favourite characters. You've got women who are fighting to be independent in a brutal world. Women like Lorena or Laurie, women like Clara Allen. You've got travellers from overseas who've come to America seeing it as a land of opportunity. And of course, all of these people, they're thrown together and they all have scars. Physical scars, but more devastatingly, emotional scars too. They all carry the burden of a brutal, bloody and traumatic past around with them. All of these characters have memories of Indian raids, civil war, bloodshed on the border, and abuse in their own private domestic lives. A lot of these characters are carrying around memories of love long ago, lost love, unrequited love, and these characters are holding on to a lot of regret, and that's what the journey is all about. It's exploring what you've done over the course of your life and what's still left for you to do. Lonesome Dove is like a microcosm for America, the nation itself, and we see that everyone in Lonesome Dove is from somewhere else and also trying to get somewhere else. You've got your home, you've got your parents' home, you've got the place you are now and how did you end up here, and then you've got the place that you're aiming to get to. And each person has a different state that is like a symbol of freedom to them. For Gus, the state is Nebraska, because that's where the love of his life, the lost love, the unrequited love is. Gus is a man who's been married but not to his true love, Clara Allen. One of the strong women protagonists of this novel. This character is the embodiment of intellect and also strong female independence. For Laurie, a prostitute who draws a lot of customers to Lonesome Dove, for Laurie, a character who McMurtry crafts as a subversion of the fallen woman, for her, the locale that's freedom in her mind is San Francisco. That's where she needs to get to, in California. And for Woodrow Cole, Montana is the goal. That's the emblem of freedom to him, a place that he's never been to because it's very far away and he's only heard about, and of course he's heard rumours of the snow. He's never seen snow before, so Montana takes on a mythic quality in his mind. And just an aside, what's really incredible with McMurtry is the fact that he's able to give us really compelling male and female protagonists at the same time. For women readers, I would implore you to read this book in order to understand the male psyche, the psyche of men from all ages, from youth to old age and everywhere in between. And for male readers, you might want to contemplate which of the men you are most like and who you might need to be more like. And by the way, what's really fascinating to consider when it comes to Lonesome Dove is not just the context in which it is set, the time in which it is set, but the context of the time in which it was written. We have the social progressivism of the 1980s really inflecting this novel. Indeed, the tone is much more 1980s than it is, say, 1880s. We hear a real tone of the history of civil rights and social justice present in this work, with the characters, their attitude towards the African-American character, Dietz, is like something out of the late 20th century rather than the 19th century. We also cannot help but hear tones of second-wave feminism inflecting the narrative, and ultimately we have this constant cry for consideration of others as human beings. The message that comes through in this book, at least to me, is that white or black, Mexican or native Indian, we are all ultimately the same. This novel was published in 1985, and so McMurtry is writing 2 decades after the formal end to segregation. He's writing with the very recent living history of the civil rights movement. He was a young man when Martin Luther King Jr. was making his speeches, when Rosa Parks refused to stand up for a white man on a bus, when they were giving voice to the nation's anger. McMurtry was in his late 20s when all of this was happening, which is a very formative age for a young man. And so the progressive opinions of the two Southerners, Gus and Cole, regarding the patchwork of backgrounds that is the nation, very much comes from this era. There's also the voice of talk therapy and psychoanalytical couch culture coming through too. But let's talk about those two central protagonists primarily. Augustus McCrae, or as you will come to know him, Gus, and Woodrow Cole. They are the two halves of man. Similar to Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. You've got the 3 Karamazov brothers, the 3 sons, who are each the personification and embodiment of a different aspect of man, and together they make a whole. You've got mind, body and soul. And if you're interested in that masterpiece, which is one of the most popular reads at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and one of the most challenging works I've ever brought myself to, then check out our lectures for that in the back catalogue at patreon.com/hardcore literature. In that same Dostoevskian sense, Gus and Cole are embodiments of 2 drastically different and yet strangely and powerfully complementary philosophies towards life. We're talking about Epicureanism versus Stoicism. That's what McMurtry tells us in his preface to the book. Gus is an Epicurean through and through. Gus teaches us how to live, and just like Shakespeare's Falstaff, his rallying cry might as well be, "Give me life." That really is his philosophy. And the interesting thing is, those who are most able to embrace life, its ups and downs, its joys and devastations, are typically those who thought a lot about death. We've spoken about this before when we read Montaigne's essays together at the book club, because Montaigne would show us that learning how to live necessitates learning how to die, how to abide the inevitable. So that's Gus. He's the Epicurean of the novel. Cool is the Stoic. He is the embodiment of Stoic principles, and he's quite an aspirational figure. I think they both are for different reasons. Cool is all about work. He's about duty. He's about commitment. He's about keeping busy and staying useful. Gus loves to think and he loves to talk. That's his chief characteristic, talking. Whereas Cool, his buddy, is all about action, taking action. And Epicureanism and Stoicism are often treated as opposite to one another. But let's consider what those philosophies mean in order to access a deeper level of appreciation for Lonesome Dove. And this novel, just like so many great works of literature, are essentially long, extended philosophical arguments. They're dialogues in fiction form. So, what does it mean to be an Epicurean? If you're an Epicurean, you're all about living the good life. Epicureanism prizes pleasure and being free from pain, both physical pain and mental pain or mental disturbance. And Epicureanism is a system of philosophy dating from 307 BC, founded upon the teachings of the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. Now, a commitment to the pursuit of pleasure might sound like hedonism. It might sound like wanton revelry, but it wouldn't be entirely accurate to see Epicureanism as hedonism. When it comes to this system of philosophy, moderation is key to contentment and pleasure. So that actually means refraining from overindulging. That means you need to be prudent when it comes to what you pursue. It's not about constant sensory overindulgence. It's not about gluttony. It's just about pursuing contentment and feeling good. And happiness to Gus is all about sitting on his porch, sipping from his whiskey jug, maybe reading a little bit of his Bible and flicking through his Latin grammar, maybe, and having a good chat, playing some cards and talking long into the night. We see that Gus loves to see the sunset and the sun rise. He doesn't sleep very much because he wants to seize the day. He wants to be awake for the two most beautiful periods of the day. Now, the embodiment of Epicurean philosophy can be found in Ecclesiastes, one of my favourite biblical works of scriptural wisdom literature that implores us, because everything has a season, there's a time to live and a time to die, and there's nothing new under the sun. One generation comes and then another passes away. Because of that, we should eat, drink and be merry. For today is all we have and tomorrow is not guaranteed. But the good life, when it comes to Gus, is ultimately embodied in friendship. And friendship to Gus is all about argument. It's all about dispute and debate, friendly play, competition in verbal form, what the ancient Greeks would call agon. We're going to talk about this with our complimentary read at the beginning of this year with our ancient Greek tragedy. I'll talk about that at the end of the video. He loves to argue. He loves to talk, and we see that Gus is able to sit with the harsh facts of life because he keeps on talking them through. We could see talk as a distraction from death, as a denial of death, or we could see talk as an avenue for overcoming death. And that's what we get in the great books. We're essentially talking, we're conversing with these great writers, and they're helping us through the most difficult facets of life. So Gus loves to sit on his porch, he loves to drink, he loves his friends, he loves to watch the sunrise and sunset. And there's a really strong argument in favour of being an Epicurean. Life is short. The brevity of life is an unfortunate fact, and our mortality, our death, is absolutely assured. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And so you should appreciate what you have in the here and now. Carpe diem. That means seize the day. Now, Stoicism, on the other hand, that's another course of philosophy that helps us bear the misfortunes of life, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. Stoicism was ancient Greek and then carried through to the Roman tradition, and is marked most significantly by Epictetus in the ancient Greek tradition, and then Romans like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. So we've got the two halves of man, the Greek and the Roman. But the life philosophy, or the paradigms of Stoicism, are all centered around virtue. Virtue is the highest good. Stoicism is all about the cultivation of emotional self-control and exercising rational judgment. It's all about self-discipline with the aim of attaining what's called eudaimonia, or good spirit. And though the two systems of philosophy are ostensibly contrary, we might think, once we get acquainted with both of them, and we will over the course of our reading at the book club, that they're not actually that different, and that they are ultimately aiming after much the same thing. So if you want to get to know the Stoics, read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman emperor, who wrote these little maxims to himself on the tented field. They were his way of talking through his problems with himself, and we're blessed that we have them. Read Letters from a Stoic from Seneca. They're fantastic, and pretend that you're in dialogue with him, that he's your friend giving you great advice. Read the maxims of Epictetus too, and you'll find a philosophy that's all about focusing on what you can control. And that means your deeds, that means your actions, that means your behaviour and your words. It's all about judgment. The idea that no one can make you feel bad without your assent is Stoic through and through. And Stoicism, we might say, is the ultimate form of exercising an internal locus of control. There are two forms of people: those who have an internal locus of control, i.e., I divine my destiny. If you're in that camp, you're in a rare breed, and you're in the minority of human beings. Most people have an external locus of control. That essentially means things happen to me, and that dictates how I behave and how I go through the world, and it's beyond my control. I can't do anything about it. If you want to be a Stoic, you take control of everything. You take responsibility for everything you possibly can. Stoicism's about doing your duty. It's about accepting the world as it is rather than how you would like it to be, and it's about applying yourself to the world with resolute equanimity. The thing is, to truly live a good life, you do actually need both, rather than just one or the other. But the Epicurean spirit, which Gus embodies, is essentially, don't make life harder than it needs to be, harder than it already is. Whereas Stoicism says, life is hard regardless, so hold fast and find meaning in that difficulty. And that's what Captain Cool is all about. And we see these two different life philosophies in how these two men treat their retirement. Yes, they're still working, but the heyday of being Texas Rangers is quite far behind them. Now they have the opportunity to work in a very leisurely way, and Gus is the one who takes that opportunity. He's all about leisure and play and enjoyment, whereas Cool will work 16 hours a day and look down on anyone who doesn't meet that intensity and that relentless work ethic. It's Cool who pushes them to take the trip, the cattle drive, the adventure, the hero's journey that's at the very centre of this book. But it's Gus that helps them to appreciate it along the way. It's Gus that helps Cool to realise things about himself and his past. So we've got Epicureanism and Stoicism running through the lifeblood of these two characters. What else should we consider when it comes to Gus and Cool? Well, we can also see that all great buddy stories essentially trace themselves back to what is considered to be the first modern novel, and that is Don Quixote by Cervantes. And I believe it was Blake Snyder who said that all buddy stories are essentially love stories, and that's so true. Whether you're reading Don Quixote or Lonesome Dove, you will see that stories about friendship are stories about the highest form of love. And what did Aristotle say when it came to friendship? Aristotle said that the highest form of friendship is when you want for another what you would want for yourself. You see another as though they were yourself, so you want the best for them. In McMurtry's memoir, he said that the ultimate source for Gus and Cool were Cervantes' knight-errant and the faithful squire. So you've got Don Quixote, who is this crazed, idealistic, overly idealistic, mad knight. He actually gives his name to the term quixotic. He stuffs his head with these idealised, romantic, chivalric narratives in a Spain that is past the days of chivalry, and decides that he's going to go on a series of quests against monsters and villains, and he's going to be the hero of his life. So many consider Cervantes' knight-errant to be mad, but as you read the book, you come to the realisation that he has chosen his madness, and that is the truest form of sanity, and everyone else is the mad one. But of course, in all of these buddy stories, you've got the straight guy and you've got the fool guy, and that's where comedy arises. And so Sancho Panza is the more pragmatic one. He's a more earthy, he's more down-to-earth, he's more hearty and humble, and both of them together get battered and bruised and knocked about, and it's very, very interesting to think of Lonesome Dove as being like a much less comedic Don Quixote in the Old West. So instead of knight-errants and ladies and all of that sort of thing, we've got gunslingers and an attempt to revive a past that was, if not dying, basically dead. McMurtry said, "Early on, I read some version of Don Quixote and pondered the grave differences, comically cast, between Sancho and the Don. Between the two is where fiction, as I've mostly read and written it, lives." And I couldn't agree more. We have a lecture series for this incredible novel in the back catalogue of the book club. It's one of my personal favourites of all time. But very quickly and swiftly and reductively, the significance of Cervantes comes in what he does with those two characters. You've got the three horsemen of the Renaissance. You've got Shakespeare, Cervantes and Montaigne. All show us in different modes, different mediums, whether it's a play or a novel or a series of essays. They show us how to talk to ourselves and how to talk to others. And I love Harold Bloom's delineation of the differences between a Shakespearean protagonist and a Cervantine protagonist. We can ultimately see that the tradition after both of them has writers falling into one of two camps, or one more than another. Bloom would show us that Shakespeare's characters are incredibly solipsistic, to the point of being narcissistic. They speak and they think their thoughts aloud and then they change, which was phenomenal and absolutely unheard of in fiction up until that point. They change by virtue of hearing themselves. They get to think through their problems aloud, and therefore that's a catalyst for change. Now the difference between Shakespearean protagonists, we're talking about inexhaustible characters, to use an A.C. Bradley term, inexhaustible characters like Hamlet, Iago, Falstaff and Cleopatra. The difference between them and Don Quixote and Sancho Panza is that these two change as well, but not because they listen to themselves, but rather that they listen to one another. And at the start of that novel, they are not very good at listening to one another, but over the course of the story, we don't really read primarily for the silly sallies and the farcical humour, though we absolutely delight in it. We read for their friendship. We read because we see them suddenly considering what the other says, and that influences their changing personality. They become a little bit of one another. They learn to listen rather than learning to talk, and both are avenues to change. We need both. We need to learn to listen to ourselves, but we also need to learn to listen to other people, and fiction, especially great fiction that has a friendship at its very heart, helps us to do that. We might even say that literature is a form of friendship. It's dialogue in monologue form. It's a discussion. We're supposed to interact with what's on the page. And I used to think that I read primarily to see more of myself, using these books and these poems as mirrors that were essentially grand Rorschach tests. But the more that I read and the older I get, I realise that the reason that I read is to spend time in the company of others. Literature helps us appreciate otherness when we are in solitude. We get to appreciate the self in the other. We get to live the lives of characters who might be incredibly different from us. They might be different in sex or age or nationality or era in which they were flung into the world. They might have incredible surface differences, but the more you read, the more you realise we all have a central commonality. We all ultimately fear the same thing and desire the same thing. We fear death and we crave love. And so we see how we're all ultimately the same, and therefore that's one of the grand values of spending time in the company of great characters. And it doesn't matter if your reading is solitary, it's all ultimately communal and communicative when you really get down to it, just on a higher level. So Gus and Cool have some really incredible literary ancestry with Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, and we might say, well, which one's which? And, well, they're kind of both a blend of the two, because this is not a comedy. McMurtry has a really great power when it comes to irony, and there are moments of humour, but it's not farcical. But there's a blend of two, and it's the friendship, it's the spirit of their friendship that we find in this book. Two people who are ostensibly different, learning to change by virtue of talking over the course of their journey. And by the way, something to consider when you read Lonesome Dove, if you find yourself really falling in love with these characters and wanting more, there is actually a Lonesome Dove series. There's a quartet of novels that you can explore. Now, this was the one that McMurtry wrote and published first, but chronologically it's not the first. So you can either read them in publication order, so you get a sort of Star Wars sequencing going on where you go backward and forward in time, or you can read them chronologically. But that's something to bear in mind when you get to the end of Lonesome Dove, if you want more of these characters. So Cervantes' inexhaustible protagonists are in there, but who else inspired Gus and Cool? Well, they have historical analogues, just like so many of the characters in this book, whether we're talking about the African-American Deets, whether we're talking about the native outlaw Blue Duck, they have historical analogues. And a lot of the events of the novel are inspired by real events, and I'm not going to get into what those events are because that would be going into spoiler territory. We'll be talking about all of that and appreciating that together over the course of the lecture series. But the real life inspiration for these two friends was from the friendship of a man called Charles Goodnight and another man called Oliver Loving. And Lonesome Dove gives us a fictionalisation of these two friends' third cattle drive, and their trail became famous and was named after them. It's called the Goodnight Loving Trail. Over the course of the 1860s, they forged a path across the country for the large-scale movement of Texas Longhorns. And Goodnight is actually in the hall of great Westerners. He was a Texas Ranger renowned for leading posses against the Comanche, and one of those posses resulted in the recapture of a woman who had been kidnapped by the tribe as a child during the infamous Fort Parker massacre. That's Cynthia Ann Parker. She actually spent more than 2 decades with the tribe. She even had children with a chief. She was actually not thrilled about being recaptured. And this leads us to some prime contextualization. You really need to understand what it meant to drive cattle across America in the 1870s. And for that, we need to understand how the Wild West was tamed. We need to learn about the blood that was shed. And one of the grand things about this story is just how much is in the backstory, in the subtext, how much is not expressed, how much is underneath it. Much of the story, much of the drama is in things that have happened before. It's in the past. This is a book about memory. It's a book about history, and it's a book about life being primarily behind us. This is a book about the setting of the sun, the waning of the West, the end of an era, but also it's about the sun setting on our lives too, because these two men are getting on a bit. They're in the twilight era of their lives, and so it's very fitting that just as they're winding down and learning to appreciate their old age, the era is winding down too. If there's a central image that encapsulates what this book is all about, for me it would be the setting sun. McMurtry essentially takes us to an age that was transitional, where the frontier, the idea of the frontier as a land of hope and opportunity, was coming to an end and was now being idealised and romanticised and a thing of the past. I think it's worth considering the opening quotation that McMurtry chooses to frame his novel with. It comes from T.K. Whipple's Study Out the Land, and it goes like this: "All America lies at the end of the wilderness road, and our past is not a dead past, but still lives in us. Our forefathers had civilization inside themselves, the wild outside. We live in the civilization they created, but within us, the wilderness still lingers. What they dreamed, we live, and what they lived, we dream." Isn't that fascinating? That's where we are. Civilization has been built on a pyramid of bones. It's been built out of bloodshed and chaos and trauma and turmoil, and that is now a dream for those who benefit from it today. Let's give a very, very swift and reductive overview of the history of the American West. And if you want some great books to dig into this very, very deeply, then I personally recommend the writings of D. Brown, particularly The American West. Though D. Brown's most influential work was Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. This was a real leap forward in understanding the American West from the Native American point of view. Those are very good. I also highly, highly rate a book that was up for the Pulitzer Prize called Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynne. That's a phenomenal book. It's about the Comanche, and if you want another one just for good luck, The Earth is Weeping by Peter Cousins is phenomenal. But here's the overview. The American West began as a Spanish borderland. The earliest frontier was during the time of European colonization from the 1500s through to the 1700s, with Spain establishing settlements across Texas, New Mexico, and California. At this time, there was no central authority in the West across the land. Instead, there was a sparse population comprised of indigenous tribal nations like the Comanche, the Apache, the Pueblo. And it's one tribe in particular that would rise up and prove itself to be the most ruthless and dominant of all the tribes. Native tribes, it's important to understand, were not all alike. Some were peaceful, some were religious, some were large, some were small, and some were built on warfare. And the Comanche were built on war. The very name of this tribe is uttered with fear across the course of Lonesome Dove. The Comanche actually had a symbiotic relationship, a working relationship if you like, with the Kiowa Indians too, but it was the Comanche particularly who were most feared. The Comanche Empire was dominant across much of Texas and the southern plains, though to call it an empire is a very interesting way of framing it, because it wasn't an empire in the sense of being like the Roman Empire. And the Comanche weren't the largest of the tribes, but they managed to cover an enormous amount of ground, and settlers would be shocked at just how much distance they could cover and how swiftly. They could be on one side of the country and then a few days later they'd get themselves to the other side and hey, there's the Comanche again. They'd cover great distances from Kansas to Texas with absolute ease. And the Comanche did not have a formal hierarchy or a religious ordering. Their hierarchy was built entirely on warriors. Who got the most scalps? Who was the most ferocious in war? Who got the most kills? Who was the most brutal? They would be the ones who would be the leaders. They would be the ones held aloft as the greatest of men. The Comanche were renowned for their thirst for vengeance and their proclivity to torture. You did not want to get caught by a Comanche tribe. Understanding this is key to understanding why the characters are so wary of the Comanche, even though they're not so much a threat anymore, not by the time of Lonesome Dove. We see when the Europeans turned up in the 16th century onwards, they entered a world that was already at war with itself, at war for domination. The Spanish settlers brought horses with them, and the Comanche would steal them. And they would use their horses in really ingenious ways when it came to warfare. Today, the stereotype of the Native American Indian is to see them on horseback, but actually most tribes were on foot. It was the Comanche who rode horseback, and what they could do at high speeds with their horses was frightening. It was a frightening phenomenon, and a lot of the settlers didn't know what to make of it. There was a cycle in which you had the Spanish bringing their horses. The horses would graze on the plentiful, bountiful land, and they would proliferate. Then they would turn wild, and then they were tamed. And settlers would raise their cattle, the Comanche would steal them, and later on they'd get stolen back and forth. They'd just steal them from one another, sometimes selling them, sometimes trading them, sometimes just stealing them again. But it's important to understand that during the time in which the American frontier was seen as the New World, the West was not some blank slate waiting to be claimed. It was already comprised of borderlands. It was already soaked in blood, and there were constant claims upon the land, claims in the form of violence and tribal warfare. And then if we come on a bit and look post-American Revolution, we're talking the late 18th century onwards, that's when we get to the time of the early frontier. Now, Victor Hugo would say that the French Revolution would be the template for all revolutions to come. But of course, what was the template for the French Revolution? It was the American Revolution, which you may know burst out of intensifying conflict between the American colonies and Great Britain, with the colonists being tired of taxation without representation. They had left the country for a chance at freedom, but now they had a king at a distance trying to govern them and control them and submit them to punitive laws. And people were tired of the British military presence. You add all of this discontent, and mix it in with some Enlightenment ideas about natural rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness and property, and then you have the spark that lit the powder keg that was the American Revolution. Post-revolution, you see the spirit of what would come to be known as manifest destiny in the people. This was a term coined later, in 1845, by American journalist John O'Sullivan, and this essentially expressed the expansionist belief of American exceptionalism, and this idea that the US and American settlers were divinely destined to expand westward across North America. So we see the ideology of expansion really characterized the age, and people saw the land as one of opportunity, where they could claim and own vast swathes of land. They could farm, they could put up settlements, and they wanted to exert cultural and political dominance. They wanted to spread the American way of life. Now, we've spoken about the Napoleonic era a lot over the course of many of our other book club reads, from The Count of Monte Cristo to A Tale of Two Cities, War and Peace and Les Miserables, but the influence of the Napoleonic era underpins not only European history, but American too. In 1803, we see that the US effectively doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase, in which President Thomas Jefferson bought almost 1 million square miles of land, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains from France under Napoleon Bonaparte, because France was bankrupting itself at the time to fund its incessant wars with its neighbours, and France was struggling to retain control of the territory anyway, so they sold it for $15 million. That's 3 cents per acre, which was an astonishing bargain, and that added much of 15 states to the US, but that also brought Americans into direct conflict with Spanish or Mexican territories and native tribes across the plains. Hot on the heels of this purchase, you have Jefferson funding a great and infamous expedition with explorers and select US soldiers under Lewis and Clark, who marched across the land and trying to map out as much as possible. The best analogy that I can think of when it comes to westward expansion and what it felt like at the time is it was kind of like when you're playing a video game and you can see the map in the corner, and what's illuminated is what's directly around you and everything else is dark until you explore it. Americans were piecing the map together, and the country was so vast that it essentially felt like many different countries, many different terrains, all in one. Other parts of the country became mythic, they became legendary. So they marched across the land and they made their presence and thus their authority, the authority of the US, known. They wanted to make their claim for ownership apparent, and they wanted to establish American presence in this part of the land before the European powers tried to establish their own. A positive knock-on result of this expedition was an incredible increase in geographical and biological knowledge. They catalogued loads of different plants and animals, and they also established trade relations with the native tribes. It's a reductionism to see the relationship as just one of animosity. But another result is the fact that the native tribes would be pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and essentially cleared out of the land that they had roamed for as long as they could. Remember, from the 1820s through to the 1840s, you see that conflict with Mexico really characterized the age. Mexico inherited Texas after establishing independence from Spain in 1821, but then in the mid-1830s you had the Texas Revolution with Texans forming an independent republic, and the pivotal event, or one of them, was that of the Battle of the Alamo, which was a 13-day siege in which just a couple hundred Texans, in defiance of Mexican law, faced off and held their position at a mission in a banquet of blood against roughly 2,000 Mexican soldiers under President General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. We can see how history becomes mythic and how legends are born in Lonesome Dove. McMurtry definitely makes a comment upon that, as we see how the Alamo gets transferred from living memory to myth via a fear that it might be forgotten. Of course, you've got the rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo." Gus, reflecting on the fact that there's a new generation up and coming, which means a new generation of people who don't know who they are, they don't know of their fame. Gus says to his friend, "Well, Cal, I guess they forgot us, like they forgot the Alamo." Why wouldn't they? Cole asked, "We ain't been around." That ain't the reason. The reason is we didn't die. That's a really powerful comment. So we've seen that before in our readings at the book club with the heroes of Homer in the Odyssey and the Iliad. What makes a hero? Ultimately, a hero needs to die. Then they pass into legend. But essentially, through this very broad sweeps account, I want to impress upon you the fact that the entire region for a very long time was unspeakably violent. And this is something that you'll know if you've read another great Western from 1985. What a year for literature, with Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. We've got a lecture series on that at the book club too. If you're interested, you might want to hold the two books up against each other because they're very, very different. It was so violent because you had a real perfect storm of many different aggressors and conflicts all at the same time. You had Comanche and Apache raids, you had incessant conflicts with Mexico up and down the border, and you had conflicts throughout the established border towns which were basically lawless and where vigilante justice reigned. It was a tough time to be alive. But in the mid-1840s, you've got the Mexican-American War, in which the US victory resulted in huge territorial gains. We're talking California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. And this would have been the time of Gus and Cole's youth. They came to Texas in the 1840s. Then from the 1840s on through to the 1870s, which takes us right up to where we are in Lonesome Dove, these decades were marked by plains warfare with native tribes. So you've got these distinct sort of gear shifts across the course of the era where one particular flavour of bloodshed reigned predominant over the others. So you had tribal plains warfare, you had westward expansion, you had settlers, you had migration like you wouldn't believe, cutting through native lands, and of course that led to increased violence. Not every tribe was content to lay down and take the crappy deals that the government were offering them. Not every tribe was content to just be pushed onto a reservation. Some tribes, like the Comanche, were there for blood and were happy to fight until the very end. As we said, the Comanche were the most brutal of all the tribes. They knew that the promises of the US government were empty, because every time they made a promise, they did not deliver on them. They would say to the tribes, we're going to compensate you, we're going to give you land, and they didn't even want that land. What they wanted was to roam free, under the sky and across the earth. And they could foresee the threat of their own annihilation in how the westward expanding settlers were treating the buffalo. To them, the buffalo was a sacred animal. It was once plentiful, and then the hunters would come, driven by commerce, and push it to the point of near extinction. The Comanche looked on and thought, if that's how they're going to treat us, then we're going down with the most brutal of fights. So the Comanche were on a different level, and they earned their reputation, their fearful reputation. They were really, really adept when it came to guerrilla warfare. They really presented a difficulty. And so whilst the expansion was going on, they were raiding the settlers' towns, and they were capturing women and kidnapping them, they were pillaging, they were torturing, and this necessitated the development of the Texas Rangers. Gus and Cole are ex-Texas Rangers, and a lot of the action that they've seen in their life is in the past. They reminisce about it, they talk about it, they remember it. They don't have as much action, not nearly as much action now when we are in Lonesome Dove, because in the 1870s things had become, by comparison, actually quite boring, because all the action was in the 1840s onwards, and they would have been responsible for fighting off those Comanche tribes. The Rangers developed in response to frontier warfare, and the Rangers became heroes. They became figures of myth and legend, living legends. They were swift gunsmen, they were really skilled at tracking and scouting, and they were called Rangers because they had the ability to range across large territories. And the Rangers really embodied the violent and yet often morally ambiguous nature of law enforcement across the frontier of the Wild West. We see in Lonesome Dove that Gus and Kyle have settled down in their old age or older age, but they still have that feistiness to them. They still have that proclivity to smack you in the face if you talk ill of them, if you disrespect them. The Rangers began their life as informal militia. They were armed bands of men across the course of the 1820s. They were Anglo settlers in Mexican Texas, faced with the mortal danger of Comanche raids and Mexican banditry. They became ruthless because they had to be in order to survive. And the defining feature of the Rangers was a spirit of self-reliance. They had great adaptability, great mobility, and an incredible knowledge of the local lands. The Rangers also played a significant role in the Texas Revolution and the war with Mexico. They fought ad hoc. They helped with scouting and raiding, and they really garnered a reputation for ruthlessness and brutality, but as I said, they were also admired. The young men would look up to them as their heroes. And the Rangers were more feared than the US Army as the primary anti-Comanche force across Texas. Now, of course, from 1861 to 1865, you had the American Civil War, fought between the Union, the North, and the Confederacy, the South, which ended with Union victory, it ended with the abolition of slavery, and it ended with the South in economic depression and disrepair. Interestingly, many Native American tribes would take sides. There were tribes that could be said to be Union tribes, and there were tribes that could be said to be Confederate tribes, and having a vested interest in the outcome and who won the war. But a lot of the Native American tribes had a vested interest regardless, because whilst the Americans were fighting amongst themselves, they didn't fight them. And whilst they were making themselves weak during civil war, the tribal nations could grow stronger. They could take advantage of it and then exploit it. So it's important to understand that Lonesome Dove takes place in a post-Civil War landscape that still very much bears the scars of that civil conflict. So we've got scars from battles with tribal nations, with Mexicans, with themselves, fighting civilly and across the course of the nation. Now, what McMurtry does is quite wise, because he gives us characters we can root for who actually did not take part in the Civil War. And in fact, they are quite wary of politics. Whilst the two sides of the nation was busy fighting one another, our Texas Rangers were trying to keep some law and order along the border and trying to defend against Comanche raids. So they didn't take part in the Civil War. Now, post-Civil War, we see that the real thing that the country was up against was dealing with that history of violence, but the violence largely was coming to an end. And the Texas Rangers, who had been a rather ruthless band of men, they were becoming formalised and more organised. They weren't like a modern police force, but they did start to have more structure and command and pay, though many Rangers would find themselves making money through smuggling and banditry and unlawful activities. But Gus and Cal are ex-Rangers. They were Rangers back when being a Ranger was more dangerous, more lawless, and where you survived by the skin of your teeth. They're not up and coming in what is now a Reconstruction era, another new world. They're from the old world and they're old school. The West, for want of better terminology, has now been tamed. It's not as wild as it once was. They've done their job, and now civilization, for better or for worse, is here. It's been built on brutality and bloodshed, but essentially we're living in a world where the majority of threats have been disarmed and neutralized. The West is safer, but that also means it's less exciting. And they still have a fear of the Comanche, but the attacks were thinning out. They were a lot less common and a lot less devastating. They wouldn't happen as frequently. They were much more rare. Let me read you something from S.C. Gwynne's Empire of the Summer Moon. This is fantastic. 6 years after the end of the Civil War, so this is around the time of Lonesome Dove, the western frontier was an open and bleeding wound, a smoking ruin, littered with corpses and charred chimneys, a place where anarchy and torture killings had replaced the rule of law, where Indians, and especially Comanches, raided at will. Victorious in war, unchallenged by foreign foes in North America for the first time in its history, the Union now found itself unable to deal with the handful of remaining Indian tribes that had not been destroyed, assimilated, or forced to retreat meekly onto reservations where they quickly learned the meaning of abject subjugation and starvation. The hostiles were all residents of the Great Plains, all were mounted, well armed, and driven now by a mixture of vengeance and political desperation. And when it came to the Comanche, no tribe in the history of the Spanish, French, Mexican, Texan, and American occupations of this land had ever caused so much havoc and death. None was even a close second. So they're a brutal tribe, but there is a real melancholy tone that comes through in Lonesome Dove. The sadness comes through when you're reading hundreds of pages in which the Indians, or the Comanche, seem to be a distant memory. People talk about them and we expect them to pop up, but a lot of time passes and passes and passes and we think, okay, so are they not around anymore? The sadness comes through in the relative lack of native tribes. McMurtry really captures that. We're dealing with the after effects of the bloodshed. So the carnage has largely, but not entirely, gone, and we are now in a cattle kingdom. We're now seeing the dawn of commerce, and we're seeing the rise of the railroads. So at the time of Lonesome Dove, Texas had a lot of cattle but had very few railroads. It's important to consider that the railroads across the course of the country, the long railroads, developed shortly after the time of Lonesome Dove, and that meant that really long cattle drives north to find new markets to sell the cattle, those drives would very shortly be a thing of the past. So there was a very brief period of around 20 years that we might call the last frontier, where men used to band in together from all different diverse backgrounds. You'd have a multiracial cast of different men all working together up against the elements, working for money, working with the promise of freedom up on the other side of the country. This was the last bit of time before the Wild West was ultimately tamed, and before you would look out and see fences and barbed wire and railroads and a lot of containment after the railroads such cattle drives would be a thing of the past. The cattle drive at the centre of Lonesome Dove is significant, not because it's the first of its kind, but because it's really one of the last. This novel does not give us the beginning of the story of the frontier, the national saga, but it gives us its waning. We see the cost of expansion, we see the reality of it, we see the scars left behind across the land, and we get this feeling of loneliness in the wake of the destruction and construction. And knowing all of this, it really makes us wonder, what are you doing it for? And we can really see the cattle drive as hero's journey. And the thing about these cattle drives, you really have to understand just how life-threatening an enterprise it was, an enterprise that would cease to be necessary very, very soon. The thing is, these cattle drives were incredibly dangerous. The dangers of driving cattle across the land came in the form of needing to cross mountains, to cross rivers, to come up against the sublime and life-threatening forces of nature. We're talking wild animals, we're talking about lightning. Lightning storms were more of a frequent cause of death than they are now. McMurtry shows us that death on the trail on these long cattle drives was really common, and the cause of mortality was often mundane. In real life, people would go on these cattle drives and they would die along the way. They'd die of cholera, they'd succumb to fever, they'd die in childbirth, sometimes they'd be attacked by Indians, they'd die from their wounds. And people knew when they set out on this sort of journey, they knew what they were undertaking. They knew that along the way, as they marched forward, a certain contingent of their crew would drop, they would fall. Not everyone was going to make it all the way to Montana. They'd drop and they'd have to bury people along the way in these graves and keep marching forwards. In fact, a very common fear was whether they would all make it there alive. So this undertaking was not ill thought out. It wasn't hasty. You really knew that you were going to be pushed to your absolute limit. And what I consider when I follow the cattle drive across the course of Lonesome Dove is the fact that it is essentially a grand, sublime metaphor for life and the human condition, because this journey is everybody's journey. Our journey is always from cradle to grave, and journeys, heroes' journeys, are all about what we learn about ourselves along the way. They're about the friendships we have along the way. It's cliche, but it's true. It's cliche for a reason. You've got the ostensible journey, and then you've got the reason you're actually undertaking the journey. So the ostensible reason for the cattle drive across the course of the country in the waning days of the Old West is to make their fortune, but that's not really it. Each of the characters has a different reason as to why they need to push themselves. For Cole is to see if he's still got it, and he has to learn something about himself as the older generation, passing the torch down and on to the new generation along the way. For Gus, this story is about reconciling himself with his lost love and reflecting upon his past. For the character of Newt, this is a journey about maturity and growing up and taking on hardship as a way of transitioning from boyhood into manhood. The journey is about different things for different people. The greatest stories are always heroes' journeys. And the greatest heroes' journeys, whether we're talking Homer's Odyssey or Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, both works that we've discussed at the book club before, or whether we're talking about Lonesome Dove, we see time and again that the journey is never about the destination. The destination is a pretense for change and self-growth. Larry McMurtry is self-consciously plugging into an epic tradition that goes far beyond the Western. The Western is just the American national saga. That is the American epic. But this book, Lonesome Dove, is just one in a long line of epics, and the epic changes across the course of time. We see that Homer, his epics are sung narratives, and then we see that Virgil responds to Homer with the Aeneid. Then we see Dante and Milton, both of which are responding to their precursors, but also giving life to the epic of their time, whether we're talking Italian or English. And then as we get closer to the modern day, we see that the epic goes from sung and poetic into the novel form. We see that with Tolstoy and War and Peace, which I would call an epic more readily than a novel, and we see that with Joyce, James Joyce's Ulysses, which is a self-conscious, swerving and incorporating of Homer's Odyssey. The epic goes into the novel, and we see that when it comes to the American epic, with long prose poems like Moby Dick. We see that with East of Eden, and we see that most definitely with Lonesome Dove. And what do great epics in all traditions teach us? They teach us that character is destiny. We see that time and again with the great epics, whether we're talking westerns like Lonesome Dove or the Homeric ones. Character is destiny. We are what we do, and we are who we associate with. That's a key message over the course of this book on the hero's journey that is our lives. Whether we're going from Texas to Montana, from cradle to grave, we are the company we keep. If you hang around with good guys, you're going to develop some healthy virtues. You might not be perfect, but you'll be pretty good. If you hang around with bad customers, well, then your fate is sealed. Character is destiny. And so we've got the historical reality of the cattle drive and how harsh it is, how brutal it is, but I really do like to see it as a grand metaphor for our life's journey. Larry McMurtry would say that he was influenced by Dante's Inferno, and he was very harsh on himself. He said that he was going after a sort of Dante's Inferno, but had ended up writing a Gone with the Wind. I would actually say that not only does McMurtry capture the Dante-esque, but he gives us not only the Inferno, but the entire Divina Commedia. Something to consider with heroes' journeys and Dante's Inferno is that they give us a chance to go back in our minds and to reflect. Dante's Inferno is a moral inventory. It's allegorical. Dante Alighieri, or Dante the Pilgrim, found himself midway on the journey of our life in a dark wood. For the straight way was lost. He'd gone off the path, and this is all metaphorical. He'd lost his way on the journey of life. And who comes along to help him? Well, it's Virgil, the epic writer of the Aeneid. He takes him by the hand and he leads him down through hell in order to ascend. One must descend in order to ascend. You must go down and through in order to then rise again. And we get all of this over the course of Lonesome Dove. This is a book about reflection. It's about meditating on your life, and at a certain stage in your life, that's a key core part of the next leg of your hero's journey. Thinking about what was it all about? And over the course of the lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we're going to want to think about Joseph Campbell's monomyth, The Hero's Journey, and we will see that we can break every key journey down, every adventure that you want to embark upon, into readily predictable stages. You've got the departure, you've got the road of trials, and then you've got the return. And each of these legs of the journey can be further broken down, and we can map all of this out over the course of Lonesome Dove. Why does it take so long for the journey to happen, similar to Lord of the Rings? Because a key part of the hero's journey at the very beginning is the refusal of the call. There's a moment, if the journey's significant, in which you hum and ha and you think, can I still do it? Maybe I haven't got it in me. Maybe it's not worth it. Am I too old? Has life passed me by? We see all of that, and then we see the road of trials begins. We see what it takes when you're swallowed by the whale in the belly of the beast. We see time and again great books follow a very familiar template. It's just what the writer does with that template and these archetypes that excites us and speaks to us and refreshes our perceptions. We're all on a quest. We may not be on a cattle drive, but we're all questing, and quests can take the form of man versus nature, or man versus yourself. We see all of that in Lonesome Dove. And we see, of course, that the perennial story, no matter where we're heading to or where we're coming from, the perennial story is always an attempt to answer the question, who am I? And there is a real melancholy tone, an elegiac tone, a lamentful, mournful tone stretched out across the course of the novel. This is a very plaintive novel, and yet there is still a voice of hope and optimism despite the jadedness, despite the cynicism, despite the pessimism, despite the sense that these characters have been beat down and they're getting on a bit. There's a renewed sense that no matter how old you are, it's never too late to live. Henry David Thoreau in Walden would say that most men lead lives of quiet desperation, and that is because these men have already died whilst still living. They've died early on and they've resigned themselves to a life that's like a walking death. Lonesome Dove tells us that death is assured, but we're not, as Whitman would say, we're not dead yet. So carpe diem. The philosophy that lives and breathes through every page of this book is that the older the violin, the sweeter the music. It doesn't matter what's been before. What matters is what you're doing in the here and now, self-consciously taking on hardship and challenge and finding meaning. As Augustus McCrae would say, it ain't dying I'm talking about, it's living. And I doubt it matters where you die, but it matters where you live. We might say it matters how you live. Yesterday's gone on down the river and you can't get it back. And if you wait, all that happens is you get older. A lot of people will defer their dreams. They'll defer the hero's journey. They'll defer taking on meaning in their life. And they could use tuition from one of these two men, perhaps both, from Augustus McCrae on how to live and love in the present, and from Cool on how to apply yourself resolutely and take on burden and meaning and find meaning there. The time's going to pass no matter what. The older you get, the more of your life is behind you, but that does not mean there's nothing in front of you, and that does not mean there's nothing in the here and now. And if you bring yourself fully to Lonesome Dove, I wholeheartedly believe that you will find the courage to resolutely apply yourself to the journey that is before you right now. Maybe you need a little push to get on the cattle drive that's before you, no matter how old you are. And I think if you really bring yourself to this book, you can use it like talk therapy, in which you can think through and talk through the issue of our common mortality. Death is a fact of life, and we're constantly faced with it, and the question of how to live essentially becomes how to not waste the present moment. We get all of that in Lonesome Dove, and this is not a book that you read, this is a book you live. But how did the novel itself come to life? Well, it actually began its life as a film script. Larry McMurtry was a screenplay writer. He started writing a screenplay with the director Peter Bogdanovich, who he worked with for the masterpiece film from 1971, The Last Picture Show, which was an adaptation of one of his novels. McMurtry worked on a good number of great screenplays. I'm thinking of the 1981 Terms of Endearment, again adapted from one of his novels, and I'm also thinking of the 2002 Oscar-winning Brokeback Mountain, which was an adaptation of Annie Proulx's short story with Diana Ossana, directed by Ang Lee and starring, of course, the late great Heath Ledger and Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, the screenplay for Lonesome Dove was originally titled The Streets of Laredo, and he wrote the film with 3 film stars in mind. John Wayne, who he wanted for the character of Cool, Jimmy Stewart for the character of Gus, and Henry Fonda for the character of Jake Spoon. Although Warner Brothers really liked the script, these actors wouldn't commit to it. John Wayne especially, who's an icon of the Western, the classic Western film, he decided not to get involved due to the melancholy nature of the film. So what was Larry McMurtry to do when he'd written this brilliant script but they couldn't get it to life? Well, he bought it back from the studio for $35,000 and then began developing it into a novel. McMurtry himself was born into a cattle ranching family with some of his uncles old enough to have been part of the end of the cattle driving days. They saw the waning of the Old West before the rise of the railroads, which connected the East to the West and all the disparate parts of the country. So he had first-hand anecdotes inspiring Lonesome Dove, inspiring him to write this story. This was born out of family stories and first-hand experience, and McMurtry came to realise very swiftly that the history of the cowboy was not as romantic as the films made it out to be. And he realised that he didn't want to be a cowboy or a ranch hand himself. He wanted to be a writer, and he wanted to unpick the Western mythology. He wanted to turn to writing and really confront the reality of cowboy life in fiction. His aim with Lonesome Dove was to demythologize the West. McMurtry wanted to inject some realism into the mythology, and that meant taking the old tropes of the Western genre and subverting them, bending them. Tropes of the Western include dusty border towns, put up shops and stores. We expect to see them. We expect to see a jailhouse and maybe a drunken jailer. We expect to see the hangman's noose hanging from a tree or hanging out in the town. What else do we expect to see in a Western? The saloon, the whorehouse, pistols at dawn, gunfights, daring gunfights. Now, McMurtry would say it's hard to go wrong if one writes at length about the Old West, still the phantom leg of the American psyche. I thought I had written about a harsh time and some pretty harsh people, but to the public at large, I had produced something nearer to an idealisation. Instead of a poor man's Inferno, filled with violence, faithlessness and betrayal, I had actually delivered a kind of Gone with the Wind of the West, a turnabout I'll be mulling over for a long, long time. As I said, he was quite harsh with himself. At the time in which he was writing, he absolutely did deliver all of that, all of the subversions of the genre. The fact of the matter is, as time went on, such was McMurtry's influence that he set the new conventions, and we start to see Westerns became more and more indebted to Lonesome Dove, where he had set down a new trail, so to speak. And to understand where McMurtry was subverting the generic expectations, you actually have to understand what those expectations were. As I said, the Western is the American epic, it's the national myth, it's the nation's saga. And what's very interesting to consider when it comes to novels of the modern and postmodern era is we see increasingly over the course of the 20th century some of the primary influences on our favourite writers ceased to be literary and started to become cinematic. They started to become filmic. As we said, this began life as a screenplay. So did several of the great works of Cormac McCarthy. Books in the 20th century go from having other writers as their precursor influence, writers like Virgil and Milton and Dante, and we start to see the great directors and the great cinematic set pieces from the era inflecting this prose. And something interesting that I've been considering a lot lately is the fact that the novel writing impulse has gone into cinema. Many lament the fact that the novel has fallen. We've seen the rise of the novel, and we might say that the 19th century gave us the novel in its heyday, and then, surprise, surprise, over the course of the 20th century, though we see some staggering works of fiction, we start to see the novel as a popular form of entertainment fall off in tandem with the rise of cinema. It's only natural. So what happens is those in the 20th century, the late 20th century, once upon a time, they would have written novels. They would have written serialized novels, pulp fiction novels. They would have written all of this, but these men and women turned their hand instead to the camera, to the screen. They started writing screenplays for the popular form of entertainment of our day. The epic is a malleable form. And it moves with history, it moves with the culture, it moves with the time. A Homer's Odyssey is not possible today. And the plays of Shakespeare are not possible today, because indeed what Shakespeare was doing at the Globe Theatre is what many great talents in filmmaking and television are doing today for the screen. If Shakespeare were alive today, he would be penning long-running television serials. Indeed, we might think of Charles Dickens and the fact that novels like Bleak House, they came out over the course of several years on a monthly instalment. They were the television writers of their day before the rise of cinema. If you think about Shakespeare's histories, if you think about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, if you think about Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, if these writers were writing 10 or 20 years ago, we would not have these novels. We would have really compelling television. All this to say that by the time we get into the late 20th century at least, we see a real symbiotic relationship between cinema, television and the novel. Films and TV shows become novelistic. Having multiple episodes to play with, having multiple seasons, means that television writers today can do things with their stories that the great writers like Tolstoy and Dumas and Dickens were doing before them. We're talking sprawling character arcs and great narratives. In a sense, thank goodness Lonesome Dove became a novel like this, because I don't know how you could make this a single film unless it was very, very long, maybe split into multiple parts. But I think the only way to do Lonesome Dove any modicum of service is to make it a compelling television show. And we're very lucky that we have a great television adaptation with Tommy Lee Jones and Robert Duvall, which I highly recommend and will be recommending to book club readers. To celebrate getting to the end of Lonesome Dove, I'm going to be imploring you to watch that masterpiece of classic television, and we'll be talking about what makes a great adaptation. One of the things to consider when it comes to Lonesome Dove is the fact that popular entertainment can absolutely be literary, and great literature is frequently also popular entertainment. They're not mutually exclusive, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the Western genre, which offers a canvas for both captivating and widely accessible escapism, and also deep wisdom and emotional challenge alike. And I think the mark of great literature is not just in its universal appeal, but it's when the writer does something within a familiar genre and they do it very well, but they also challenge that genre, subvert it, give it twists, and add things to it. They add to the tradition, the conversation. The whole tradition is richer because of them. And I think we see all of that in Larry McMurtry's masterpiece. And I say this to emphasise the fact that from 1910 to 1960, the Western was so popular. It was the #1 genre in Hollywood. And it was a run-on from the intensely popular dime novels that exploded out of the 1880s. We're talking cheap, popular, sensational entertainment. We're talking mass circulation and mass production. These writers would churn out stories in all different genres to turn a buck. Romance, crime, detective, and of course the Western. War stories were very popular, but the Western was king in America. And what the Western did is they would take figures of recent history and they would mythologize them and turn them into types. So these Westerns would give us real life figures like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Wild Bill Hickok, and turn them into legends. I think it's very interesting to consider the fact that genre fiction is so frequently scorned by those that study literature, because essentially everything really comes down to genre. Everything is of a genre, and as creatures who love stories, we don't actually like novelty all that much. We like familiarity. It's interesting to note that Shakespeare only wrote 2 truly original stories, and everything else was a retelling, a spin on an old tale or several tales wound together. We love genre because we love knowing what to expect, but what we want is we want to see how a different writer gives their own unique flair on expectations. We love that feeling of subverted expectations, where we go into a story expecting one thing and being surprised with another. And so we need genre to have the expectations in order to have them subverted, and then the subversions are added to the storehouse of tropes that continue to build the genre. It's a fascinating conversation across time. And my contention is that film and book lovers will always have one genre that rises head and shoulders above the rest as their personal favourite, but the Western really is a special one when it comes to the landscape of American cinema and American storytelling. The Western as a genre was there from the beginning. It was there when Hollywood was being born and when it rose. We see in 1903, right in the early days of Edison-produced films and silent cinema, we see one of the first films is, of course, The Great Train Robbery, which is about a gang of outlaws holding up and robbing a steam train in the Wild West, and it was based on an 1896 play. And it's interesting to consider just how close to living history these legendary stories were. We go back to The Great Train Robbery, and we see all of the tropes and elements that would continue to recur across the tradition. We expect robberies and hold-ups and heists. We expect dramatic chases across sublime landscapes. We expect thrilling shootouts between gunmen. We expect a thrilling finale, and indeed we see an homage to this film in the crime films of Scorsese, for example. You might think of the end of Goodfellas. Martin Scorsese pays homage to this film by having Joe Pesci shoot directly at the camera, which is directly evocative of the opening of the Great Train Robbery. It's amazing to see that the Western genre is there, distilled and influencing every other genre, whether we're talking crime or film noir, whether we're talking war films. And the history of the Western's fascinating because we see this eddying back and forth where we have Westerns and then we have samurai flicks which are influenced by those older Westerns, and then the Westerns that come after the samurai flicks are inspired by those samurai movies. And back and forth they go. Film, just like story, is a conversation across time. It's important to understand what the conventions and what the landscape was like prior to Lonesome Dove, because Lonesome Dove really subverts a lot of expectations. Sometimes you might not realise what you're expecting until you vocalise it or until it's disrupted, but you come to this book and hey, this really isn't like any Western that came before it. It's pretty unique. We might reductively see a split down the Western tradition in two types of film. You've got the films of John Ford and of Howard Hawks from the 1930s, 1940s and 1950s. Films like Rio Bravo. Films like The Searchers, based on the novel by Alan Lee May. And although The Searchers gave us a John Wayne who was a bit of an anti-hero, those older westerns still had a rather simple split between good guys and bad guys, the cowboys and Indians. And we have a Rio Bravo quality come through in Lonesome Dove in the fact that Rio Bravo, watching that film, just feels like hanging out with old friends. That's what we get a lot of in Lonesome Dove. We've got a split between the Howard Hawks style of Western, and then the Western as a film seemed like it had seen its day. There was so much popularity for it, hundreds and hundreds of different Westerns produced over the course of the 50s, and it seemed like cinema lovers were now drifting away and they wanted something different. Until enter the Italians, enter Sergio Leone, enter Clint Eastwood and the spaghetti Westerns, which were shot on the plains of Spain. Talk about refreshing perception, trying to capture that feeling of the wild frontier. And we start to see a very new Western came in to shake things up. In the films of Ford, you've got pretty straightforward moralism for the most part, and then in the films of Leone, we're talking the Man with No Name trilogy, like A Fistful of Dollars, all the way through to The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. We're talking about Once Upon a Time in the West. We have really gritty realism, and we have grey morality, where the good guys are kind of bad and no one's perfect. We have cowboys who aren't idealised. They're not picturesque, they're not glamorous, they're sweaty, they're dirty, they're gritty, they're violent. And the fact of the matter is, we get both of this come through in Lonesome Dove. We get those old John Wayne style good guys versus bad guys, but we also get the gritty realism and the violence and brutality of the Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns. And we get something a little bit different too. It feels like Larry McMurtry's taking both of those traditions and forging on in his own direction. And over the course of the lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we're going to put our finger on exactly what his contribution to the genre was. So how does Larry McMurtry subvert the genre? Well, Taylor Sheridan would say brilliantly in the introduction to the 40th anniversary paperback edition that Lonesome Dove is a West never before explored in literature. It is one that makes no attempt to apologise for, nor justify Western expansion. Likewise, to the victims of a land completely absent the rule of law, McMurtry's West relied upon each character manifesting their own moral code, because none had yet been established in this place. Detractors of this book will charge it with being just popular fiction, but we've got to talk about the novel's literary qualities. You see techniques in Lonesome Dove that you'd expect more from Jane Austen and Marcel Proust than you would the dime novels about Billy the Kid and the Wild Indians. Here's one thing to look out for: the technique of free indirect discourse. If you read Jane Austen with us, then you know what this is all about. This is a way of telling a story in third-person omniscient narrative style, but inflecting the narrative with the thoughts and viewpoints, the opinions of different characters. Larry McMurtry does this in such a sophisticated way that it will feel like a kaleidoscope, like we're hopping from one mind to another in a very short space of time. We go from Gus to Cool to Lorena to Newt. We go through all of the minds and we get to understand more about the world and more about about the human condition because we see the world piece by piece from everybody's point of view. The whole book is a sublime cycling through of seeing the same events from different perspectives. This is so subtle that it's easy to miss. This is so subtle that it's very easy to take for granted. We're going to really focus on this in the book club. Another thing that McMurtry does brilliantly is how he renders temporality in the passing of time. For example, a quick example, a character will ride up, Jake Spoon, the eponymous archetypical hero, and with this character, McMurtry takes the sort of idealised pulp hero and really subverts that type. I won't say any more about that, but he's riding up, we see him on the distance, and as we do so, we go back in time, we go back down memory lane in one of the character's minds for several pages. And then, by the time Jake Spoon, or whoever it is, arrives, we know more about him, we know more about the character who's now going to speak to him, and we know more about their shared history, and we feel as though time has passed, 2 different levels of time. The time it's taken him to ride up to us, it feels like that's happened in real time, and this sort of lived, shared past, this collective consciousness, this shared history that's gone before. We get all of that. More than anything, this really does give us the effect of living in the world. We feel the passing of time and we get given the opportunity to change because of it. So I don't know about you, but that sounds like great literature to me. Multiple perspectives, the ability to play with temporality, and not only that, we also get another subversion, not only of the Western genre, but much of the tradition of so-called men's literature by the fact that we get a work that gives us a lot more feeling than objective reporting. Lonesome Dove has more in common with fiction from the likes of George Eliot, who we see is an influence and gets an overt name drop, than fiction from the likes of Hemingway. It really is hard to express just how much of a monumental influence Hemingway was over the course of the 20th century. If I can name 4 influences for the modern era, it would be Hemingway, it would be Tolkien, it would be Joyce, and it would be Orwell. But Hemingway's influence was so monumental, his objective reporting, his just write one true sentence, his prose stripped bare of emotion. Hemingway can't write comedy very well. Now, there's an argument to say that all he writes is essentially comedy, but it's not very funny and there's not a lot of feeling. It's very bare. It feels emotionless a lot of the time. This is a masculine, brutal, very modern style that was so influential that most writers ended up sounding like a Hemingway ripoff. Even Hemingway in his old age, he sounded like self-parody. I cannot express just how monumental it is for a writer like McMurtry, like Steinbeck too, to form their own voice in the wake of Hemingway and not sound like Hemingway. Over the course of the lecture series, we'll be holding up some short stories from Hemingway that deal with very similar themes and motifs, and you'll see the difference. And the fact is that Larry McMurtry manages to do some very complicated things in a very simple way. This is simple storytelling. This is the bread and butter of narrative done very, very well, made very, very accessible, complicated motifs of the human condition, complex narrative techniques, but a very easy reading experience, which ultimately fulfills the aim of literature, which is to connect us to one another. This is one of those books that I see time and again, people do not read alone. They read this book with their parents. I know a lot of people say that it reminds them of their father. They read this book with their brothers or their friends or their sons, their daughters. A lot of women love this book intensely too. Daughters and mothers read it together, friends read it, and that's what we're going to be doing together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We're going to be accessing the communal power of literature, and this community really is a literary oasis. It's an absolutely incredible place to hang out with like-minded lovers of great art. We have no shared background. We're from all over the world, all professions, all ages, all walks of life, but we're connected by our love of great story. Here are a few ways that Larry McMurtry manages to subvert the Western genre. 1. He gives us men who feel and men who cry. You'll be surprised. Be on the lookout for this. Count the men who cry. You'll see quite a few men shedding tears before you ever see a woman shed tears in this book. The Western archetype of the lone gunsman, the outlaw, was a hard man, a stoic man, and we've got that in Woodrow Cool, but these men in these old westerns, they never shed tears. The closest you got to it in the old days was John Wayne in that famous scene of the search researchers after the massacre by the Indians, saying, "Never ask me about it again." Here we see that men feel and men cry, and I really do think that's the reality of life. I think it's part of myth, collective myth, that men used to be harder, that they used to be hardened, that they used to have no emotions. Maybe they had to deal with more things and more trauma, but we're the same humans. Men absolutely did cry. So we see that. Not only that, but the heroic cowboy, now in McMurtry's hands, becomes old, becomes tired, becomes a bit uncertain and jaded and beaten down. These cowboys are past their prime. They're not idealised. Their bodies hurt. They're suffering from aches and pains, and they're just having to assimilate with the ageing process. These are men who have seen it all, they've done it all, and most of their life is behind them. And indeed, the two danger periods when it comes to male depression and suicide are late teens, early 20s, for one reason, and 60s onwards. And I think the reason for the danger spot being in the 60s is because this is a popular age of retirement in which you might have a time to think and slow down, and you see the waning, you see that a lot of your life's behind you, and you start to think, what was it all for? And what do I do now? These cowboys are dealing with that, rather than the sort of overly idealised and glamorised heroic exploits that we might have come to expect. We've got that subversion quite apparent in the fact that we've got one cowboy who fits that stoic type, a type who's struggling to get in touch with his emotions. We've got cool juxtaposed and held up against Augustus McCrae, who wears his vulnerability on his sleeve, who wants love and has a lot of love to give. With these two men, heroism takes on a new meaning, and we see from Lonesome Dove that heroism is not just a young man's game. Another way that Larry McMurtry subverts the Western genre is, again, coming back to the idea of manifest destiny, the idea of the frontier as a landscape for your destiny. Lonesome Dove, as a border town, is quite uninspired, and we see that the cattle drive that they undertake isn't driven by destiny or even necessity. They say it's about making their fortune, but it's not. The cattle drive is inspired by restlessness, very much like the feeling of Tennyson's Ulysses, post-Odyssey, that weariness, that need to go out and fight again and find who you are in the midst of chaos. And we see that the frontier still has its challenges. Yes, there are Indians. Yes, there are storms and lightning and wild animals. But rather than holding an inherent feeling of promise despite the harshness, instead the landscape feels empty, it feels rather barren, and it feels to be arbitrarily punitive and ultimately indifferent. And the excitement of progress and expansion, that's gone, that's not there. The land's already been mapped out and traversed, and so what's left? The true progress must come from within. But essentially, the men are ultimately dealing with a landscape that, instead of being spiritually uplifting, we have a landscape that's quite monotonous, empty, dull and intermittently brutal, and the causes of death, here's another subversion, are almost always, invariably, unheroic. They're not glamorous. It's actually shocking how much meaninglessness there is in the violence. Rather than seeing duels at dawn or gunfights to settle matters of honour like we see at the opening of A Fistful of Dollars, we see that danger comes arbitrarily and randomly and senselessly, and death is often the result of the mundane rather than the heroic. And another grand subversion comes in the form of the women. McMurtry is renowned for writing compelling female protagonists. In westerns before Lonesome Dove, a lot of the women were simply prizes to be won by the men, or they would complement features of the male protagonists, whereas McMurtry refused to stereotype, idealise or romanticise when it came to both his women and his men. He wrote full-rounded protagonists, not just men, the hero, not just women or the woman. He wrote human beings coming up against the human condition. And this is why post Lonesome Dove we see McMurtry's influence everywhere. The greatest legacy of Larry McMurtry, the greatest influence, can be seen in two works primarily. We see it in the Rockstar video games of Red Dead Redemption, and we see it in the HBO television series Deadwood, from the golden era of HBO TV. In Red Dead Redemption, and Rockstar overtly acknowledged the influence of Lonesome Dove, which is similarly quite revisionist West in its approach to history. We get a West that is waning, where the era of gunslingers and cattle drivers is coming to an end, and the Wild West has begun to be tamed. We get character-driven storytelling, we get flawed characters, reflective characters, characters that are not types or mythic archetypes but real people, and the violence is frequently realistic and mundane, and has real consequences. Loss is frequently senseless and meaningless. In that video game we get these pockets of contemplation, these long rides across the country. That's where the sublimity is, or it's in a conversation with somebody. That's where the real genius comes through. It's in the backstory as well. And then of course Deadwood, I really highly recommend you watch that TV show. You've got the gritty realism and you've got a West that's in a very transitional period. And so effectively Lonesome Dove ushered in an entire age of new, brooding, realistic and unromantic stories in all genres, not just the Western, but you can feel his influence in the superhero genre to crime noir and even science fiction. And I'm going to leave it there for today. I hope that gets you excited for reading Lonesome Dove. If this is your first reading, I hope that's added a new layer of appreciation, or if you're rereading, I hope that's added some historical nuance that can aid you in getting even more meaning out of this great book. We're going to be reading this book over the course of January and February at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We are going to be alternating between two reading projects, Lonesome Dove and Ancient Greek Tragedy. Together we're going to be reading the Oresteia of Aeschylus. We're going to then read Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, and then we're going to finish off with Medea by Euripides. And we're going to go back and forth between the two. One weekend we'll have a discussion on Lonesome Dove, the following weekend we'll have our Greek tragedy discussion, and then we'll be back to Lonesome Dove. Your reading assignment for the next lecture is at patreon.com/hardcore literature. At the bottom of the post for this video, there's a resource section. Along the way, I'm going to be recommending films. With each lecture, I'm going to be recommending 2 films at a time that are icons of the Western film genre. So you can pace that out and treat yourself to a Western film each week. And then I'm going to recommend a bonus film from the filmography of Larry McMurtry. To see the films that I recommend for this week going into next week, check out the post at Patreon. Along the way we're going to be recommending films, documentaries, music, and we're going to have thought-provoking questions to stimulate conversation in the reading threads under the lectures, which gives us some of the greatest conversation around the great books I've seen anywhere in the world. I absolutely adore the conversation that takes place at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and I absolutely adore the community. And I would like to say a huge thank you for watching today. This coming weekend, we're going to have an introduction to Ancient Greek Tragedy, so look forward to that. And for now, as we're kicking off the new year, I'd like to say, a very happy new year. I hope you have a very happy, healthy new year filled with lots of rewarding reading challenges. And I would also like to know, what's your experience with Lonesome Dove? Have you read it before? Has it been on your TBR for a while? Is this a reread or a first time reading? Let me know what you're looking forward to, and if you have read it before, what advice would you give to readers to facilitate a meaningful reading experience? Thank you so much for watching today. I appreciate you, and happy reading. Good luck on the journey across Lonesome Dove. Bye bye for now.